Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland, Portland's own Citizens Forum. I am Susan Hammer, President of City Club. First, a reminder to turn off your electronic devices, things that beep, ring, and break into song. We have a few announcements before we begin. Next Friday, on November 10th, we will be reviewing the election, Decisions 2006, with pollsters Lisa Grove, Tim Hibbets, and Bob Moore. We have other upcoming events at City Club that I'd like to talk with you a little bit about. First, we have these yellow cards that you'll find on your tables. City Club continually strives to present programs that are important, meaningful, and timely. You can help us plan great programs for next year by taking a minute to complete the community scan card that you have at your table. You can also fill it out on the website if you prefer. That's at pdxcityclub.org. It's theater time again. City Club's theater series, Public Life, will feature a performance on Sunday, November 5th, entitled An American Daughter. Discounted tickets are available for purchase by calling the Profile Theater. And for more information, please pick up the theater series brochure in the back. This month's Citizens Read selection is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. It'll be held on Monday, the 27th of November at City Club Commons. You can purchase a book in the back of the room. 10% of the proceeds go to City Club. And this is open to members and guests alike. Please let City Club know by calling RSVPing ahead of time. Details about these events and all other events at City Club can be found in your weekly brochure or online. We are always hoping for new members at City Club, and we have 2 new members today that I'd like to introduce to you. And would you please hold your applause until they both have stood. Jesse Smith is a new member, and Ralph Leftwich. Would you please join me in welcoming them? We are so fortunate in Portland to have great corporate sponsors that help make these programs possible. Our sponsors this quarter are Baron Liebman, LLP, and Zimmer Gunsel Frasca. Please join me in thanking them. Our program today is entitled Campaign Finance Reform. Are Measures 46 and 47 right for Oregon? Well, we are at that stage in the election season when many of us have turned off commercial radio and television, just waiting for the day when the barrage of campaign ads end. We shudder to hear the words, and I approve this message, because sometimes we can't imagine how anyone could. The negativity and the cost is getting to us. A lot of money is spent here in Oregon by individuals and organizations, both inside and outside of the state, on candidates and ballot measures. In our governor's race alone, the combined spending tops $13 million. Oregon is one of only 5 states in the country with no limits on campaign contributions. And if that's a problem, we now have a proposed solution in the form of 2 ballot measures that would ban corporate and union contributions and restrict individual contributions. These ballot measures are opposed by an interesting group of allies: corporations, labor unions, and nonprofits. You don't see those 3 together very often, who argue that the proposed solution only creates a whole new set of problems. One thing we know for sure is that this is no simple matter. Ballot Measure 47, I noticed in my voter's pamphlet, is 9 pages of very small print, and the arguments go on for, pro and con go on for another 20 pages. Like yesterday's Oregonian article indicated, this is complicated stuff. Here to help us understand these ballot measures are, on the far right, Dan Meek, FairElections Oregon, Damiana Merryweather from Protect Our Voice, and our moderator with us today is Paul Gronke. Dan Meek is a proponent of Measure 46 and 47. He's a public interest attorney here in Portland. Dan came from Pocatello, Idaho. He graduated from Stanford Law School and has practiced law in Portland since 1987. He and his colleague, Linda Williams, have represented electricity ratepayers and public interest groups. They have litigated to finality and settled cases providing monetary benefits to ratepayers of over $300 million, including a $10 million amount that was refunded by PGE to ratepayers in Multnomah County in 2006. Dan also represents groups and individuals that sponsor ballot measures, including FairElections Oregon and groups advocating the creation of people's utility districts and Citizens for Safe Water. Dan is also a notary public. A notary public, that is. Couldn't help it, Dan. Okay, and Dan has spent the last 7 Januaries cycling in Asia. Damiana Merryweather, on my immediate right, is speaking against the measures on behalf of Protect Our Coalition, a Voice Coalition. She's a native Oregonian, originally from Southern Oregon, and a graduate of the University of Oregon. She's a longtime advocate who has volunteered for NAREL Pro-Choice Oregon, and she currently serves as volunteer chair for Basic Rights Oregon Equality Pact. She came to Protect Our Voice Coalition as a volunteer, deeply concerned about the negative impact that Constitutional Amendment 46 and Measure 47 will have on nonprofit organizations. She is also a world traveler, has been to 17 countries on her own. Our moderator today is Paul Gronke. Dr. Gronke is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Reed College. He studies and writes about American politics and methodology, specializing in convenience and early voting, public opinion, congressional and presidential elections, and social science methodology. Paul is a marathon runner, having completed recently the Portland Marathon in 3 hours and 7 minutes. He lives in Portland with his wife and 4 children. Now, how we're going to proceed today is as follows. The program will have several sections. Each panelist will give a 4-minute opening statement. The proponents of the measure will go first. The timekeeper today is Heather Kmetz from the law firm Sussman Shank. Second, following the opening statements, the panelists will respond to questions suggested by City Club members and others from the community posed by me. When I pose the question, actually it should be Paul. When Paul poses the question to the panelist, he or she will have 90 seconds to respond. The other panelists will then have 60 seconds to reply if he or she wishes. Third, we will open the floor to questions from you, that is City Club members. And finally, each panelist will have an opportunity to give a 3-minute closing statement. So we will begin with Paul. We will begin with Dan.
Paul is my middle name, so I'll begin now. In real life, I'm an attorney who defends ratepayers against utilities. And if you're a PGE customer in Multnomah County and you haven't seen a refund on your on your bills for the past 2 months for Multnomah County tax, talk to me later. Today I'm a volunteer on behalf of a coalition that includes the Sierra Club, Osberg, Oregon Gray Panthers, small business organizations, and others who want to protect free speech for everyone in Oregon, not just free speech for the corporations that provide the big money for political campaigns here that drowns out the free speech for everyone else. In Oregon, political campaign spending is literally out of control. As the Salem Statesman Journal stated in its editorial supporting both of our measures last week, Oregon has become the Wild West of political finance. Want to buy an election? Come to Oregon. Oregon is literally the only state in America with no limits whatsoever on political contributions. There are 45 other states that have systems of limits. There are 4 states that have some limits, and Oregon has no limits. Since the Oregon courts decided 10 years ago that the Oregon Constitution does not allow limits, the amount of spending on candidate campaigns has skyrocketed from $4 million to over $50 million this year. Candidates for governor are going to spend, I believe, over $15 million. Mr. Saxton has received $2 million from the Republican Governors Association, which is a nonprofit and under Oregon law need not disclose its sources of funds. That's a problem also with some of our opponents, like Our Oregon. It's a nonprofit corporation. It never discloses its sources of funds, and it never has to report its contributors to the Secretary of State or any other state authority. Of course, the governor has also, as we noticed in the paper today, received large contributions from Nike and other corporations, as well as will probably receive about $2 million of assistance from the unions. Oregon State Senate races are now costing in excess of $1 million. It looks like some will cost significantly more. Oregon House races are also up to $1 million or more, as in the case of the Minnis race in East County. Most of the money comes from corporations and the groups they fund. They outspend the unions 5 to 1 and everyone else by hundreds to 1. Only 2% of the money for legislative candidates comes in the form of contributions of $50 or less. 75% of the money comes from 1% of the contributors, and the biggest spender wins 90% of the time. The big money donors then get what they want from Oregon government. The private utilities got to keep $1.5 billion they charged us over the last 8 years for phony income taxes they never paid. Video poker outlets get $100 million per year in excess commissions, thanks to the contributions to candidates by the Restaurant Association. Drug companies make hundreds of millions per year by stopping the state and small private employers from using therapeutically equivalent drugs or negotiating for lower drug prices. And of course, the corporations' property taxes over the past 15 years in Oregon have been cut in half, and their share of Oregon's income tax has been cut by 80%. It's now down to only 4% and probably going lower next year. Our solution is measures 46 and 47. 46 is a one-sentence amendment that allows adoption of limits on political contributions. It does not, as the opponents' postcards say, cross out Article 1, Section 8 of the Oregon Constitution. It only says we can be like the other 49 states and have limits on political contributions. Measure 47 is the law that contains the limits, which basically is like McCain-Feingold in that it bans all corporate contributions and independent expenditures, it bans all union contributions and independent expenditures, and it limits individual contributions. We then go beyond McCain-Feingold in 2 ways. We also limit what a wealthy candidate can spend on his own campaign to $50,000, and we limit individual independent expenditures, that's the Swift boat, folks, to $10,000 per person per year. We believe that with these measures, we will take Oregon government out of the hands of the corporations and restore it to the people.
I'd like to begin by thanking you all for having us here today to have this discussion about Constitutional Amendment 46 and Ballot Measure 47. These are incredibly complex and incredibly important issues that voters need to understand before they vote. So thank you so much for having us here. I want to reiterate who I'm here on behalf of today. I'm here on behalf of Protect Our Voice, which is a coalition of progressive, politically active, nonprofit organizations and unions that have come together to oppose these measures because they are gravely concerned about the harm that they would do. You know, I come here with a bit of a heavy heart as a progressive at seeing the destructive effect that these measures have had in terms of tearing the progressive community apart. I want to make sure that you understand that the members of our coalition support meaningful campaign finance reform. In fact, many of the members of our coalition actively supported the last campaign finance reform measure in 2000, Measure 6, the Clean Money Campaign. And that includes Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, Oregon League of Conservation Voters, and Oregon Action. The only reason that we have come together today is because we have to reluctantly identify that these would do more harm than good. And that's why I'm here before you today. I want to briefly go over what these 2 measures do. Constitutional Amendment 46 sounds like something pretty simple. It's 1 sentence long, but it's important to understand that it goes well beyond simply allowing Measure 47 to be enacted. What Constitutional Amendment 46 does is eliminates our guarantee under the Oregon Constitution that you and I have any right to impact the outcome of any election through contributions or expenditures. For those of you who say, I don't write checks, so that doesn't mean anything to me, it's important to understand that contributions and expenditures are more than just checks. They're also donating time, space, organizing volunteers, and delivering them. So it's a pretty broad implication. So what it would do is take that guarantee out of the Constitution and hand that power to limit what we could do over to the legislature and outside initiative funders like Lauren Parks. And then our rights to free speech would only be managed by the U.S. Supreme Court, which, as we all know, has recently been filled by George W. Bush, not folks that I'm deeply confident about handing my civil liberties over to right now. Measure 47 institutes a very complicated system, and for any of you who've read the Oregonian's several articles and editorial and seen the charts of what this measure would do, it's an incredibly complex system of limitations, restrictions, and penalties on individual donors to candidates, campaigns, and to nonprofit organizations that are politically active. We are concerned that these constraints will seriously chill political speech, limit nonprofit capacity, and create unnecessary legal and administrative barriers for the organizations that represent the voice of most Oregonians in the political system. Even Representative Peter Buckley, one of the original chief petitioners on this legislation, is now urging a no vote on Measure 47 because he's come to understand that these will actually make the system that we have now worse. And groups who usually lead the way on campaign finance reform, like the League of Women Voters and Oregon Action, could not find a way to support these measures. Despite their good intentions, Measure 47 will end up limiting nonprofit organizations who do the most important work to engage voters in Oregon while leaving wealthy individuals to spend their money as they please. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Dan and Damiana both for providing us some context and for staying within their allotted time. I want to change the rules of the game a little bit here and ask both Dan and Damiana a few questions about their stances just to make sure we understand where both are. I also wanted to comment a bit on where we are right now in the election in Oregon. Many of you may think that this presentation today is a bit behind the times because many people have already returned their ballots. Based on the figures we have right now, 35% of Oregons have already cast their ballots, so they'll obviously be missing the important information provided today. But that still means we have 700,000 votes to be cast statewide. 150,000 are still coming into Multnomah County. And those of you, as Susan already said, if you want to stop those phone calls and mails, just return your ballot. One other thing I wanted to give people a little bit of background on if they want to get more information beyond the information we're getting today. There's some very useful websites out there. Both Dan and Damiana are affiliated with websites that will provide you background information. There's also OregonFollowTheMoney.org, which provides a very nice analysis. And both Dan and Damiana have been engaged in public debates on a few of the blogs in town. So if you want to know more about that, there's more and more to read beyond the very extensive materials that are in the voter's guide. For both Dan and Damiana, could I ask a few, following the lead of the bus project, just yes, no questions? Would that be okay? Both of you are in favor of campaign finance reform. Would that be a yes?
Yes.
This.
Just in general, campaign finance reform, you think that's...
Well, it depends on what it is.
Okay, but just kind of in general.
So yes or no question?
And
It
how
depends,
about...
It depends on what it is. A lot of things can be called campaign finance
I
reform.
understand, but in principle, you're in favor of it.
In principle, I'm in favor of limits on political contributions.
Okay, and how about publicly available reporting of campaign donations?
Yes.
Yes.
Finally, publicly financed campaigns?
Yes.
Maybe I have a coalition, so but many of the members of our coalition have
All right.
supported
So
that.
that's interesting. We have two people on very similar sides of this issue. So I want to ask one additional question. Again, I'd like to try to change the rules just a little bit here and provide each of the proponent, the opponent, 60 seconds to respond simply to questions that were provided to me by each other regarding the funders and who are behind these both behind the opponents and the proponents, because many of the debates over campaigns, particularly initiative and referendums in Oregon these days, seem to be over who's paying, and much less over the actual content, which is what I think we really should be discussing. So I don't want to devolve into personal attacks about individuals or groups. I don't think that's where I want to go, but simply ask each of the panelists to respond to what the other has said regarding where their money's coming from and who is backing these efforts. So this is from Dan describing Damiana. And again, I'd like to limit it just to 60 seconds. I know these are controversial statements, but I want to get this out of the way so we can really go into the content and not over the supporters. So Dan writes, the supporters of measures 46 and 47 have filed reports showing over 1,800 contributors to the yes side of these measures. Your side, Damiana's side, has filed reports showing 2 individual contributors to the no side. Apart from the unions, your group is funded by in-kind contributions by Our Oregon, a nonprofit corporation that never reports its sources of funds to anyone. Why does your main supporter refuse to disclose where its money comes from?
You know, I really want to actually focus on the untold story of what our support and what our coalition is, which are all of our nonprofit members who are truly putting forward a grassroots campaign on this measure. You don't see them on our CNEs because they're busy spending their money finding other very dangerous ballot measures like 43 and 41 and 48 that are out there. But what you will see if you look around are their presence in letters to the editor, guest opinions in newspapers, presentations at public forums, and direct person-to-person, voter-to-voter contact. And that's the true story of who our coalition is. And we are grateful to the unions who have stepped up to help support us in this important fight, because the nonprofits are the ones who truly have the most to lose and the most at stake. And we are grateful to the unions for being our good faith partners and helping us support this important job.
Thank you. And now for Dan. Damiana writes, your campaign relies on 2 donors who have contributed over $680,000, more than 70% of the funding for these measures, one of whom actually used considerable personal wealth to finance 3 unsuccessful runs for the Senate to decry the role of big money interests in Oregon politics. If you believe in the power of grassroots political action to raise enough money through small donations to run effective campaigns, why haven't you demonstrated that with your own measure?
Did you say one of them has access to personal wealth?
I'm sorry?
Did your question say one of them have access to personal wealth?
That was, the question said one of the contributors.
That's right. That would be Harry Lonsdale, who is a retired business executive who created Bend Research in Central Oregon about 25 years ago, one of the most successful businesses in Central Oregon. Our campaign is supported during the signature gathering phase by over 1,000 volunteer circulators and also over 1,800 individual contributors, in addition to Harry Lonsdale and myself. I think it's fair to say that the entire political establishment is against our measures and always will be, against limiting political contributions, and so we need to come outside of the political establishment in order to obtain the signatures and run the campaign. Since the measures qualified for the ballot, however, we've been outspent by more than 3 to 1. We have a press release that's on the back table as you go out, indicating which corporations and corporate groups are funding the opposition. They are the main funders, and they're now over $300,000. The unions are over $200,000, and one individual contributor is $75,000. So,
okay.
So that's it.
Thank you. Now we're going to go to the normal 90 seconds with the response. But thank you both for, I just wanted to get some facts on the ground so that we can have those out of the way. I think most everyone agrees that the role of money in politics is a great concern both in Oregon and nationally. Many have pointed to the role of money has created widespread cynicism, disgust, and apathy among the public. Clearly something is very wrong. This has been addressed at the federal level, and there have been a number of attempts to address this in Oregon and in Portland. What I'd like to ask of Dan is, without some other sources of funding, isn't it possible that Measure 47 actually takes too much money out of politics? By limiting PAC-to-PAC contributions, by limiting individual expenditures, does it make it impossible for those unknown candidates to get their message heard and actually end up benefiting incumbents and others who are already holding most of the power in politics?
I think we should compare our proposal to the existing federal system. It's quite similar. The existing federal system, I think no one can say there's not enough money in elections for Congress, for example. Under that system, there are no corporate contributions and no corporate independent expenditures. There are no union contributions and no union independent expenditures. The only difference between the current federal system and our system, proposed system for state and local offices, is that we also limit individual independent expenditures. For example, the Swift boat folks. Under our system, it's $10,000 per individual per year. Now, the opposition says, well, maybe that limit will be struck down. This U.S. Supreme Court did strike down a $1,000 limit in federal elections on individual independent expenditures in 1976. We believe it would qualify under the circumvention rationale, just like all of the major provisions of the McCain-Feingold Act qualified under that rationale in 2003, but in U.S. Supreme Court decision. But in any event, we also require that no matter how much is spent by individuals on independent expenditures, that every ad must identify the top 5 contributors to the independent expenditure campaign, the businesses that they are engaged in, and the amounts they are spending on the campaign. We believe it will make those independent expenditures either ineffective or positively counterproductive. So, is there enough money in federal races for Congress today? I think there is, and our system establishes just the same limits, except that we limit the Bob Perry, so instead of contributing $8 million to Swift boat veterans, he can only contribute $10,000.
If this measure did what brought Oregon into line with federal limitations, then we wouldn't be here today. The truth is, with these low dollar limits on individual donors, small donors, it will put new candidates at an even greater disadvantage in terms of trying to cobble together enough money to run effective campaigns. But wealthy candidates and those who are willing to rely on external independent expenditures will have the ability to spend as much of their money as they want to run themselves. So it means actually that it will be more difficult for regular folks, for working people who want to run for office, to get enough small dollar donations to run effective communications campaigns, especially in rural or spread out districts where they can't literally go door to door and meet every single person.
Damiana? Are we on again? Thanks, sorry. Damiana, everyone seems to agree that independent expenditures through political committees and donor committees are the loophole in traditional campaign finance reform. In fact, Dan has mentioned a number of times the Swift boats ads, but in fact, these types of spending continue at the federal level because they found a provision in the IRS tax code that allows them to continue to raise money. So by some people's estimation, the McCain-Feingold limits are simply circumvented. There have been no limits. What I'd like to know, Damiana, that you pointed to and on your website and Susan referred to, and the Oregonian, in fact, says that Measure 47 is just too complicated, it's too long. Isn't Measure 47 simply comprehensive and somewhat a clever attempt to anticipate loopholes and really limit the influence of money in politics?
Measure 47 is Rube Goldberg-like in its construct. It's so complicated in trying to foresee every possible place that any problem may now exist or in the future exist that it actually sort of defeats itself. It seeks to place limits that experts agree are not constitutional. For instance, you heard my opponent talk about limits on wealthy individuals, but legal experts agree that those limits will be overturned under federal precedent, and wealthy individuals will be able to keep spending their money as they please to run their own candidacies and to run independent expenditure campaigns. The law does not have to be complicated to work well. We all follow laws every day that we understand that are simple and straightforward, and this is an example of trying to create the perfect mousetrap, but missing the point.
On complexity, our opponents are sending out mailers, by the way, that put on there a chart that they made up. That's not our chart. They just made it up. In addition, the Oregonian printed a chart in its editorial and also made that up. That wasn't our chart either. And maybe you didn't notice that a couple of days later, the Oregonian did run a correction saying that there were several errors in the chart that they made up. And in fact, it wasn't our chart at all. So the folks who want to argue complexity can't do so by looking at the provisions of our measure. They have to make something up and then claim that something else is complex. Damiana said, and on the subject of low limits, by the way, I would ask if there was enough money in politics in candidate races in 1996, when limits like ours were in place for one election cycle under the 1994 measure that we passed by a vote of about 72%. What happened then is that the amounts from corporations and unions went way down, of course, but also the amount of small contributions went up. And I'm told from candidates who ran then that the amount of volunteer time also went way up because people understood they could make a difference.
Let's talk for a moment about the Oregon difference. Oregon is rightly proud of its progressive political tradition, reformist impulse, high levels of citizen participation, and generally fair and free election system. Dan, the free speech code and provisions in the Oregon Constitution is something that many Oregonians are rightly quite proud of. Is this something we really want to change?
It's something that we have to change. The Oregon, if we want any limits on political contributions, the current system is we can have no limits whatsoever, that any individual, any corporation, even foreign corporations with U.S. subsidiaries, non-U.S. citizens can pour in unlimited amounts of money into Oregon races. We also have a disclosure system that is consistently ranked F by studies by UCLA Law School and the Pew Trust, because under our system, a voter cannot find out who is contributing to candidates until well after the election. That's why we consistently get an F. We must amend the Constitution because the Oregon Supreme Court in 1997 said we cannot have any limits under the current Constitution. So, Measure 46 simply says, the people through the initiative process or the legislative assembly by 3/4 vote of both houses may enact and amend laws to prohibit or limit contributions and expenditures to influence the outcome of any election. That simply allows us to control, allows the people with the initiative process or the legislature to control contributions just like the people and the legislatures in the other 49 states can control contributions. We put in a 3/4 requirement so the legislature could not repeal low limits. When low limits have been enacted by legislatures elsewhere, or I should say reasonable limits, legislatures have repealed them. They repealed them in Massachusetts in 2003. They significantly altered them in Colorado in 2000. They significantly altered them in Ohio in 2004, and they repealed them in Missouri in 2006, all by less than 3/4 majorities, sometime by voice vote.
In order to enact limits, we do have to amend the Constitution, but we don't have to do it nearly as broadly as what it's done in Constitutional Amendment 46. Constitutional Amendment 46 not only allows Measure 47, but it allows a broad range of unintended consequences and broader restrictions on our political free speech. An amendment could have been drafted that was much more narrowly worded and would have had very clear outcomes. This one does not. I think it's important to look at the supermajority restriction on the legislature. 3/4 majority means that a small handful of legislators could obstruct any attempt to fix problems with legislation like Measure 47. It doesn't give the power to the majority, it actually gives the power to a tiny, tiny minority to obstruct constructive change. And that's another problem with Constitutional Amendment 46.
Damiana, let's get down to the brass tacks. Oregon's campaign finance system doesn't even merit the label. We have no campaign finance system. Well-funded corporate interests, and I don't mean here big corporations. I mean, in addition, unions, well-financed interest groups on the right and the left, as well as businesses and deep-pocketed individuals, can buy and sell electoral outcomes as they can in almost no other state. In fact, this year we've seen some of the worst examples of this as out-of-state groups and individuals are bankrolling expensive initiatives, campaigns, and funneling monies to their chosen candidates, all to promote issues and agendas that really have very little to do with Oregon, but have to do with the fact that we have a wide-open door for campaign spending in this state. You claim to be protecting, quote, our voice, the voice of all Oregon, but aren't you just another well-heeled, well-funded interest, albeit one that stands more on the liberal side than the conservative side of the political spectrum? What are your solutions for the campaign finance system in Oregon?
I wish I was well-heeled. First of all, I will agree with you. There's a serious problem with large donors and funders funding outside initiatives that are trying to hijack Oregon's political system. Measure 46 and 47 don't do anything to address that. What they do is place a system of limitations on small individual donors and on the nonprofit organizations that are our voice in the system in the political process that work to engage and inform voters so that we can be participants in the process. But experts agree will not place ultimately any limitations on those wealthy funders who fund independent expenditure campaigns or wealthy candidates who can run themselves. It takes our imbalanced system and actually makes it worse. Makes it worse. That's why we're here, not to defend the status quo, but to say we deserve better than what we have now. And if these measures took us to a better place, even incrementally, then we would support them. But they actually make a system even more imbalanced, giving even more power to those folks who have too much now and taking away from those of us who depend on groups to represent us and our values in the political process.
Well, I'm a little bit confused because in their literature, the opponents say that Measure 46 does address initiatives and allows folks to place limits on contributions and expenditures on initiatives. It's true that it does on the state level. The U.S. Supreme Court, however, has never upheld limits on contributions or expenditures on ballot measure campaigns, struck them down in Massachusetts in '78, the city of Berkeley in '81, et cetera. So I'm a little confused about that response. But I think an important question to the opponents is, where is your plan? If you're in favor of campaign finance reform, where is your plan? They mentioned their group supported a measure in 2000. That was not limits on contributions, that was public funding. And we believe public funding will not work without limits on private contributions to go along with it. In order to get the limits, we need to amend the Constitution. We've worked for 8 years on this. We've had dozens and dozens of open meetings. The union folks attended. And it wasn't until after we'd collected 80,000 signatures on these measures that the union folks who are funding Damiana's groups stood up and said, well, we don't like it anymore. Please stop. Well, they didn't say please. They just said stop collecting signatures.
We're going to move to that part of our program where we take questions from the audience, but we'll begin with a question from our board host, Bill KRAMER. Bill is a member of the City Club Board of Governors, and he chairs the City Club Finance Committee. In real life, he's a consultant in healthcare management, finance, and policy. Bill.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks very much, Dan and Damiana. As Paul noted earlier, many people are concerned about the public's growing sense of cynicism, apathy, and disillusionment with the American political system. Bob Herbert, the op-ed writer for the New York Times, wrote in his column earlier this week, "The politicians, special interests, and the media are in a state of high excitement over next week's midterm elections. But that excitement contrasts with what seems to be an increasing sense of disenchantment and unease that ordinary Americans are feeling when it comes to politics and government." My question to both of you, if your side wins on Tuesday, what will be the impact on this problem of citizens' disengagement from politics?
Go first. Okay. Well, I think it will have the effect that imposing limits had in the 1996 cycle, which is the number of small contributions significantly increased. People understood that they could make a difference. Right now, what difference can the average person make? In Oregon, 99% of the people don't make political contributions at all. Of those contributions that are made, 75% of the money comes from 1% of the contributors. So now we're down to 1/100th of 1% of Oregonians providing 75% of the money. So I think the average citizen rightly believes that he or she doesn't have much of a say. And I can tell you from my experience going to the legislature for many years that they don't. In my experience in the legislature, if the corporations have a position on an issue, that's the end of the story. If they don't, then the legislators ask, do the unions have a position? If they do, that's the end of the story. Only if the corporations and unions don't have a position is anyone else heard, and that includes environmental groups, social justice groups, and everyone else. Legislators in Oregon and all public office holders have to be very careful about what they do. The example in the paper today about Nike, I think, illustrates that. If a legislator or public official offends any big corporation in Oregon, they know that that corporation by itself, or with a few of its friends if it wishes to engage them, can overwhelm that candidate at the next election with their campaign contributions. And that they can even do it in a way that that doesn't even disclose that that's the corporation that's providing the money. A for-profit corporation just needs to form a nonprofit corporation, run the money through that, and it's all reported as being money from a nonprofit corporation under the Oregon system.
Many of our coalition partners were already talking about pursuing solutions before we found ourselves in this mess. And I like to believe, in fact, I'm very optimistic that when Oregonians look at these measures and defeat them, it will create an opportunity for those of us in the progressive community to come back together, to heal this rift, and to look for real solutions to the problem. Because I believe the commitment will still be there. It will be there from the proponents, and it will be there from us, which it's been already. We could start with very, very straightforwardly matching Oregon's limitations to the federal limitations, reining in the power of big corporations to dominate political activity. Without harming small donor groups and membership organizations. You know, the important thing here is to come up with something that actually shoots down Goliath, but doesn't end up with Goliath landing on top of David, which is what we would get with these.
Okay, questions from City Club members, 30 seconds or less. If you'd like to ask a question and you're a City Club member, you need to get in the line. Ends with a question mark is not a speech, and if you like, please direct it to one of the panelists. Thank you.
Joe Smith, City Club member for Dan. Dan, as you know, I've been trying to do something about campaign finance for 34 years. Under your proposal, which is 9 pages long, with 46 worded as it is, it appears to me that if, either because of court action or simply some unintended consequence, a sensible majority recognizes that there ought to be changes, if I understand 46 correctly, it's going to take 45 representatives and 22 senators to make any correction. How can you justify putting that kind of a straitjacket in the light of the fact that we haven't had that sort of a majority for sensible measures that were controversial in the last 30 years?
Thanks, Joe. First of all, let's keep in mind that the Oregon legislature in 1973 repealed the limits on campaign contributions that Oregon voters enacted in 1908. That's what we're trying to prevent here. If a simple majority of folks who are elected under the big money system can essentially negate our measure by changing the limits or simply by repealing Measure 47, then the game isn't worth a candle, or vice versa, or whatever that saying is. In addition, Joe, your assumption is not correct. If the legislature wants to make simple corrections, and everybody agrees that it's a correction, there's no reason to expect that a 3/4 majority could not be obtained. If the legislature wants to mess with the limits, yes, we want a 3/4 majority. But even then, all the legislature needs to do is, by a simple majority, refer a measure to voters. And the voters, by a simple majority, can adopt it. I think that's a pretty good check on the legislature. And if we don't use that check, then what will happen to us is what happened in Massachusetts. A very liberal state, very liberal legislature. In fact, it's like 85% Democrats in the legislature in Massachusetts. What did they do? The voters enacted a full public funding system. The legislature refused to appropriate the money for it. And then in 2003, repealed the whole thing by a voice vote. And that was 85% Democrats did that.
Chris Almond, City Club member. Can you hear? My question has to do with whether or not we can do any campaign finance reform with just the initiative process or through Salem. The issue being that Nike wrote the wave of anti-annexation fervor, and the unintended consequence is that the average Beaverton resident is paying a lot more taxes. They say that David Anderson wrote in the Oregonian that Nike is one of 10 properties that would decrease the taxpayers' rates by 43 cents per thousand, and we have a school district bond that's 51 cents per thousand. So my question is, can we get tax reform through our legislative process, or do we have to do it through the initiative process?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, although I think tax reform is a very different question than what we're looking at here today. What we're talking about here is fundamentals of how we elect officials, which of course does relate to tax policy, and which is why it's so important that community organizations and statewide nonprofit groups who are the voice for individuals be able to fully participate in the process of selecting and moving good candidates who are accountable to large constituencies into the political realm. And diminishing the voice of groups like that, like Measure 47 does, actually moves legislators away from that place of accountability, because it diminishes the ability of citizen and membership groups to be participants in that process, hold legislators accountable, and elect good legislators.
Good afternoon to both of you. Mark Bunster, City Club member. This question is for Mr. Meek. Mr. Meek, could you verify, please, for me, the word that's coming from the Secretary of State's office that Fair Elections will be fined $10,000 for a reporting violation? And in that context, would you agree that a campaign that is seeking to impose limits and restrictions on others should aspire to the highest possible standards of compliance and also full public disclosure of their contributions and expenditures? Thank you.
Sure. I think the only one who's been asserting something about a fine is yourself. We have filed, that is the committee, Fair Elections Oregon, has filed all of its reports on time. It files electronically, and it does so by email. So we filed electronically a report, I think it was on October 2nd, I think was the report, October 1st, something like that. And what happens with the Secretary of State's system is that we filed it in the morning, and so about 3 or 4 hours later, the Secretary of State sent back an email saying that the filing had been rejected, giving no reason for it. And so we said, what's the reason? And they said they didn't give us the reason. So we filed it again. It's rejected again by their system. What's the reason? We don't know. So we looked over the filing that our treasurer did and finally figured out that there was an extra tab. That is the Excel spreadsheet. Had created an extra tab in the tab delimited text file that the Excel spreadsheet created. That was the defect. So if we get fined $10,000 for that, I think that will sort of illustrate how distorted the present system is. Instead of paying any attention to the big contributors, and instead of paying any attention to getting out information to the public about the big contributors, the Secretary of State's office focuses on these sorts of absurd errors that are actually created by their own system. Their own system, which does not accept regular spreadsheets. When you try to file a regular spreadsheet with the Secretary of State, they don't accept it. They only accept something that is in an arcane format that they require, and it causes the errors. Their format actually causes the errors. And so we'll see.
Could I ask for a response in the second half, please?
And what was that?
Do you agree that a campaign that seeks to impose restrictions and regulations on others in the venue of campaign finance should aspire to the highest possible standards of both compliance and reporting and disclosure?
Oh, absolutely. We have done that. We have also voluntarily disclosed our full contributor list to anyone who has asked, including the press. Our opponents, on the other hand, have not. Our opponents do not disclose at all the sources of funding for Our Oregon, which is the major contributor to Protect Our Voice, which is the organization that Damiana is representing, in addition to the labor unions that also provide funds for that group.
Damiana, do you want to respond?
Well, it's interesting. My opponent says that we haven't disclosed and then lists off all the information that's public information that we filed as part of our reports. We are very upfront about who we are. We are a coalition of progressive nonprofits and labor who have come together to oppose these measures because of the harm that they would do. We are proud of who we are. We are proud of the individual supporters that we have received, as well as the organizations, and we are proud of the campaign, the very grassroots campaign that we have run.
John Mansfield, new City Club member. it's unclear to me why this isn't a debate just about 47. Ms. Merryweather, in particular, could you please tell me why, if a voter agrees with the two of you and thinks that there should be meaningful campaign finance reform, she shouldn't just vote yes on 46 and no on 47?
I think that's an excellent question. Thank you so much for asking it. 46 does tend to get overlooked in because there's so much complicated stuff to discuss about 47. The problem with 46 is how incredibly broadly it's worded and the implications that it would have in terms of its long-term harmful effect on our freedom of political speech in Oregon. Oregon has a proud tradition of having freedom of speech protections that are greater than that are afforded to us by the U.S. Constitution. That makes me proud as a native Oregonian. And the change that 46 would bring to the Constitution would not simply allow what's in 47, but says that you and I no longer have any guarantee under the Oregon Constitution to impact the outcome of any election through contributions or expenditure. If I was an outside funder who, as we've discussed, comes in and proposes these ballot measures that in many cases are incredibly harmful to Oregon and the fundamental principles that Oregon is founded on, but am opposed consistently by labor unions and other organizations of education groups and parents, the first thing I would do is take advantage of 46 to place restrictions on those groups that oppose me on a consistent basis. And the Oregon Constitution would allow for that. And then we'd end up going to the federal Supreme Court and asking them to protect our freedom of speech. And this court does not appear to me to be heading into a more progressive position of protecting our civil liberties.
Dan, would you like to respond?
Obviously, unless we amend the Oregon Constitution, we will remain the only state with no limits and the only state whose people have no opportunity for limits, and the money will keep pouring in. Basically, the money seems to be doubling in every election cycle, at least for the major races. And if we want that to continue, then just don't amend the Constitution. I don't understand some of Damiana's answers. On the one point, she says that our 46 is so broad. Then on the other hand, when it came to her answer about whether we can limit contributions to or for ballot measures, she said that our measure didn't address that, so it was too narrow. So I'm not sure what she's saying. But in any event, we need to adopt it in order to have any limits at all. It is of course, everyone will continue to have their First Amendment protections. In fact, Oregon will continue to have a more robust free speech protections than other states. That those protections, however, will not extend to allowing unlimited contributions in candidate campaigns. The U.S. Supreme Court has consistently upheld limits on political contributions, Missouri in 2000 and McCain-Feingold in 2003, and our measure is very similar to both of those.
We're at the point in our program where we'll move to our closing statements. Sorry, we don't have time for more questions. We will begin with Mr. Meek, 3 minutes.
Well, I have the disadvantage of going first twice. I don't think anyone disagrees that we have a serious problem with money in candidate races in Oregon. No one has disputed the fact that the corporations outspend the unions 5 to 1, outspend everyone else hundreds to 1. No one has disputed the fact that they get their way in Oregon government, and I think the question about tax reform was an important one, because campaign finance reform and the lack of it here affects all issues. Why is it that Oregon corporations' property taxes have gone down by 50% over the last 15 years? Is it because the state of Oregon and the school districts don't need the money as we're doing so well? I don't think so. Does it matter that the corporate share of Oregon's income tax has declined by 80% over the past 30 years, which corresponds exactly to the period of time after the Oregon legislature in 1973 repealed the limits on campaign financing, on campaign contributions that the voters of Oregon enacted in 1908? Let's take the example of Colorado. In Colorado, the voters enacted campaign finance reform, strict limits, in 1996. The Colorado legislature then, folks enacted under the old system, decided that they were going to increase those limits by a factor of 10 to a factor of 15. The initial Colorado limits were very similar to those that we're proposing in Measure 47. The legislature thought they should be, 10 or 20 times higher, so they made them 10 or 20 times higher. In 2000, The folks in Colorado then got a little bit upset by that, and so they put the entire limits, and this was about 20 pages worth of limits, they put them all in the Colorado Constitution. Of course, we can't do that here because of the Armada decision, but they put them beyond the ability of the Colorado legislature to change, and they did that in 2002. In the first election cycle in which those limits were in place, those much lower limits, the Colorado legislature, for the first time in decades, flipped from being both houses Republican to being both houses Democratic. One of the first actions they then took was to refer to voters in Colorado a measure to suspend the Tabor spending limits for 5 years. And that was an act then passed by voters by a vote of 52 to 48%. So when you have limits on contributions, basically the same thing happened in Montana. They enacted strict limits in 2002. The legislatures then became Democratic, and of course now we have also a Democratic governor in Montana. Limits on contributions do make a difference. They do matter. Our system is just like McCain-Feingold, except we have limits that are appropriate for the state level, as Oregon voters specified in 1994. In addition, we close the known loopholes in McCain-Feingold. That is, individual independent expenditures and use of candidate wealth. We limit a candidate to spending only $50,000 over her own money in a statewide race. Oregon is first in many good things. In campaign finance reform, Oregon is last. With these measures, Oregon can go from worst to first, and as the Salem Statesman Journal has said, it can restore the Oregon government to the people of Oregon.
As you've all heard today, we don't disagree about the problem. There is a serious problem with outside wealthy individuals and interests influencing and domineering Oregon's political system. If I seriously thought that Constitutional Amendment 46 and Measure 47 did something constructive to solve that problem, then there would be no debate today. For laws to be effective, any type of law, whether it's campaign finance or otherwise, it has to be clear and it has to be compelling. And these laws fail on both of those points. Laws don't have to be complicated for us to understand them and follow them. We follow good laws every day, and they help bring structure to our lives and to the state. These would not do that. You know, the proponents intend to solve a very real problem, but really they take an already unfair system and they make it worse. I can't stress that enough. That's why Stand for Children, Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, Oregon League of Conservation Voters, and dozens of other groups that have actively been proponents for meaningful campaign finance reform in the past have to stand up and say, these don't get us there. The proponents will ask you to take their word on it. They say, we've thought of everything and we've come up with a perfect solution, and y'all should just vote for it. I would never ask you to take my word on it. I ask you to look critically, read the measures, read your voters' pamphlet, and then look to groups that you know and trust that share your values and your priorities, and ask, why don't they support them? Because they move us backwards, not forwards. I ask you to join those groups that I've mentioned and so many more that are in the Protect Our Voice Coalition, along with nearly every newspaper in the state, which has said, reject these proposals. Oregonians deserve better, and they can do better. I ask you to, if you are committed to campaign finance reform, to join us after this election to find something that truly works, that truly makes the system better, and that moves us all forward. Thank you so much for your time. Again, I urge you to take a look at our website if you want to learn more, protectourvoice.org. Learn about who we are, why we oppose them, and what we can do to move forward together to come up with real solutions. For now, though, I urge you to vote no on 46 and 47. Thank you.
On behalf of the City Club of Portland, I'd like to thank Dan Meek, Damiana Merryweather, and Paul Gronke for a very enlightening discussion. I'd also like to thank our timekeeper, Heather Kometz, our members and guests for participating, and our TV and radio audience for their interest in City Club. Thank you all for coming, and we are adjourned.